to be able to support crews on them. There's no use launching them until there's a vehicle available that can actually transport a crew to them. And that's one of the reasons why, because Genesis 1 and 2 were so successful, they decided they didn't need any more test models.
Isn't that wonderful? Wow!
Well, that's their story, and perhaps other people have some other information about Bigelow's real situation, but that's from my conversations with the company executives, that why launch something that's designed to support a crew until you've got a crew spacecraft ready to support that? So that's why they're very interested.
Soyuz.
They've talked to the Russians about Soyuz, but they've talked to SpaceX. They're partnering with Boeing right now about crewed spacecraft that could service their space stations. But they've decided that they will hold off launching future spacecraft until there's a system ready to service them. You should also note at the same time that Bigelow is actually expanding their facility in Las Vegas. They've got a large factory in the northern suburbs of Las Vegas that they're in the process of building an expansion onto. Apparently, they at least anticipate additional business in building larger modules. When and if that materializes remains to be seen, but they are making a rather concrete, no pun intended, bet on that right now.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Bert Rutan, because Bert Rutan really knows his work with composites, and that's quite a significant advantage. I do not have anything like that respect for Robert Bigelow, because Robert Bigelow made some money by setting up a new chain of low-cost motels. Wow, I'm impressed. Wow. Yeah.
I don't think any of us in the room are shocked to hear no bucks, no Buck Rogers. I think all of us at some point in our lives, most of us for at least the last 10 years, some of us repeatedly over the last several decades, have had our idealistic noses rubbed in the financial realities of spaceflight. Mm-hmm. It was probably 35 years ago that my father sat me down and taught me the facts of life, which consisted of this. If the question is why, the answer is money. If the question is why not, the answer is usually money. This is a preface. The professor had brought up a very good, a subject that touches close to my heart, that of safety regulations. I have an interest because about 10 years ago I was called down to Oklahoma City at CAMI and asked to write a position paper on who we should allow to fly, who we should not allow to fly. So I stuck my nose in the books and studied, and 4 weeks later came up with a very well documented, totally researched, and absolutely unbiased by any tinge of reality set of guidelines for what I thought would constitute safe commercial space travel. Now my question is this. I think it was a private named Paul Dunbar, I may have that name wrong, who was the first airline, well, the first fatality, the first one to fall off the Wright flyer, get himself hurt or killed, and I think that was the impetus for a lot of the safety regulations.
You're thinking of Thomas Selfridge, I believe.
Selfridge.
Selfridge.
Thank
Paul
you.
Laurence Dunbar was a poet who died of tuberculosis. He was a friend of the Wright brothers, though, but Thomas Selfridge was the first to die in an airplane accident.
For whom we have the name of Selfridge Air Force Base.
And so the question is, do you see, okay, two-part question, who do you think should be writing the safety regulations for commercial air flight, irregardless of who already has started writing those same safety regulations? And do you see an analogous development between the way safety regulations came about with commercial airline flight with the way that we see them developing today?
I can say something about safety regulations because I flew in just this very afternoon from New York. 2 years ago, I had a stroke. It took away much of the use of my right leg. So I needed a wheelchair when I was going to and from wherever I was going in the various airports, which I was using today. Did I need to have special observations? Did I require special permission? Did I require unusual regulations? And the answer was no, I flew. Because air travel is safe. It's safe enough even for a guy like me. So if we ever get to something like that in spaceflight, we'll know.
Probably the unpopular answer is government should write the regulations, because they do have to apply to everybody. So that's what happened in aviation, is after the Air Commerce Act, the government gradually built the regulatory structure that brought safety to commercial aviation, usually welcomed, because the airlines knew that fatalities meant sudden drops in passenger loads, and people didn't want to fly. Fear over fare was a huge factor in the history of aviation, and throughout the 20th century. They had to overcome that. Again, if you're going to have mass flight, if you're going to have everybody fly. So I think that probably the government, probably something like the FAA, would have to come up with the regulations for the safety for human space flight as well. But also, it'll take a long time. And, when you go from suborbital to orbital, if you're flying them to a space station, there's going to be all kinds of permutations. So it's going to be an evolving kind of thing. That's how it happened with aviation. So I assume that it would be something like that, but I believe probably the best source for that regulation would be the government. I know free marketers love to talk about self-regulation and all of that, but I think either the economic collapse recently or the BP disaster tells you that, that doesn't work. Government regulation doesn't always work either, but I think that's probably where it will come from.
Excuse me, Janet, you're invoking the Air Commerce Act. What was the year of that act?
1926.
Well, I'll add something about the current state of the regulations or lack thereof. Right now, the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation, AST in the FAA lexicon, does have rules. I don't know if it's an official rule or if it's still proposed rulemaking for medical standards for spaceflight crew. So pilots, co-pilots, and the like, what class of physical that they have to, class 2 physical that they have to pass in order to do so. They have not set any sort of rules for spaceflight participants. That is the official, it's not passenger, spaceflight participant in the official language of the FAA for that. That is for the time being left up to the individual companies, because as far as the FAA is concerned, the health of the individuals does not affect the safety of the flight of the overall vehicle. If someone gets terribly sick on the flight who's just a passenger, that doesn't affect the ability of the pilot to land the vehicle safely, as well as to protect the uninvolved public. And protecting the uninvolved public is the highest level of safety that FAA AST mandates. More so than actually even the flight crew of the vehicle. I noticed you mentioned being at CAMI. I don't know if you ever ran across Melchor Ancinano. He gives great talks. He's talked to some of the FAA conferences and elsewhere. He is a doctor at CAMI, talking about what sort of rules that should you set. Who should you allow to fly? What sort of medical conditions? And it's still very much an unknown, because we're still trying to understand the conditions. At least for a suborbital flight, the environment isn't nearly as stressful as it is for an orbital flight. In terms, yes, you'll be exposed to weightlessness, but it'll only be for a few minutes. Probably not really enough time to get terribly sick for those people who are going to suffer from from zero-G sickness. You're going to suffer acceleration, but not necessarily as bad or for as long as for an orbital flight. Radiation really isn't a concern because you're only going up to 100 kilometers very briefly and back. And Virgin has been putting a lot of its customers through a series of training. They've taken them to a facility outside Philadelphia called NASTAR, put them in a simulator. Centrifuge spun them up to 6 or 8 Gs, which is, I think, the maximum acceleration during reentry. And they have found that 90-some% of the people who've signed up have passed that. Including some fairly elderly people that they thought that might have some issues, have been able to withstand that. So they're very optimistic that for suborbital spaceflight, that the vast majority of people who are at least in reasonably good health are going to be able to survive that. Orbital is a whole other story, particularly if you're going to talk about being up on, say, like a Bigelow station for a month or 2 months or something like that. Very different situation. The medical guidelines are probably going to be a lot more strict.